Welcome. I'm Karla Kubitz, Associate Professor in Kinesiology and Faculty Fellow for Facet. Today we're going to talk about student assessment in hybrid and online courses. The picture on the left illustrates a hypothetical traditional testing situation. Students are in the classroom and they're completing their work alongside their classmates and under the supervision of their instructor. They are probably not allowed to look at their notes or to discuss their answers with one another. The picture on the right illustrates a hypothetical online testing situation. The students are in their own space, wherever that is, and they are working independently. The many differences in the two situations pose challenges for assessing learning. Today's workshop will describe some of the challenges inherent in assessing learning in hybrid and online classes, and identify evidence-based strategies for responding to them. Some of the challenges inherent in assessing learning in hybrid and online classes include planning assessments, the practicalities of giving assessments, supporting academic integrity, providing feedback, and grading. We'll spend some time this session discussing each of these. As Barry noted, good assessment plans are connected to learning intentions or outcomes, and they are made up of a variety of assessment procedures. In previous modules, you've learned about the use of backward design to develop learning outcomes, and you've been introduced to the idea that outcomes and assessments are interconnected. That is, good assessment plans are tightly connected to course learning outcomes. Good assessment plans also include appropriate criteria for judging performance, and they provide support for student learning via feedback. Let's talk about planning assessments. There are two main types of assessments. The first are the traditional assessments. The second are the alternative assessments. Paper and pencil tests are the traditional way of measuring learning. Their strengths include their objectivity and efficiency. Their limitations include their tendency to focus mostly on the retrieval of facts. To do traditional assessment well, it's important to be able to write good multiple choice questions and to be able to write multiple choice questions that measure higher order thinking. Bram provided some guidelines for writing good multiple choice questions. These are for the STEMs. STEMs should be meaningful by themselves. That is, the student should be able to answer the question without having to look at the alternatives. STEMs can be either questions or partial sentences. They should not contain irrelevant material. In addition, it is recommended to use negatively worded STEMs only when the learning outcome requires it. The example illustrates a situation in which the learning outcome requires a negative STEM. These are Bram's guidelines related to the alternatives. Alternatives should be plausible. They should be stated clearly and concisely. That is, if there are repeated words in the alternatives, they should be moved to the STEM. Alternatives should be mutually exclusive and free from clues about the correct response. Test-wise, students know that the longest alternative is likely to be the correct choice. Alternatives should also be homogeneous in content and, where appropriate, presented in a logical order. Finally, the number of alternatives can vary. Research has not shown any additional improvement in psychometrics as the number of alternatives increases beyond 3. Because test-wise students can get them right without actually knowing the course material, the use of all of the above and none of the above as alternatives is not recommended. Unless strategically written, multiple choice questions tend to focus on lower order thinking. If we want to assess higher order thinking with traditional assessments, it's essential to be able to write multiple choice questions that assess higher order thinking. Some possibilities include multiple choice questions that ask students to interpret charts and graphs, to justify methods and procedures, or to respond to scenarios. In addition, multiple choice questions that vary the verb likewise assess higher order thinking. Vary the verb questions take Bloom's higher order verbs and turn them into multiple choice questions. These are some examples of multiple choice question stems that vary the verb and fit the apply and analyze levels of Bloom's taxonomy. These are some examples of multiple choice question stems that fit the evaluate and create levels of Bloom's taxonomy. In addition to traditional assessments, alternative assessments can also be used to measure learning in hybrid and online classes. Alternative assessments usually refer to assessment techniques that are something other than traditional pencil and paper assessments. They typically ask the student to produce a product of some sort or to perform a skill or task. As Barry said, they are also sometimes referred to as authentic assessments, performance assessments, and productive assessments. Self and peer assessments also exemplify alternative and authentic assessment techniques. These alternative assessment techniques would be appropriately used to check recall and understanding of a lecture or a reading assignment. The focused listening technique asks students to list and quickly define 3 fundamental concepts related to something they've just learned. The empty outline technique asks students to fill in an empty or partially filled out outline of a reading assignment or lecture they're listening to. The memory matrix technique asks students to complete a matrix, like the example. These alternative assessment techniques would be appropriately used to challenge students to apply or to do something with information that they've studied. The directed paraphrasing technique asks students to paraphrase something that they have learned for a specific audience and/or a specific purpose. The student-generated test questions technique asks students to generate questions they might expect to see on an upcoming exam. The paper or project prospectus technique asks students to create a prospectus for a paper or project, including topic, purpose, intended audience, major questions, basic organization, and resources required. These alternative assessment techniques would appropriately be used to check the student's ability to solve a problem and to explain why they did what they did. The problem recognition task asks students to recognize and identify different types of problems. The documented problems solution technique asks students to keep track of and to justify the steps they take in solving problems. The audio and videotape protocols technique is similar, but asks students to audio or videotape themselves solving problems. These alternative assessment techniques would be appropriately used to assess the student's ability to analyze and think critically about what they've learned. The pros and cons grid asks students to list the pros and cons, or the costs and benefits of a decision, strategy, or conclusion. The Analytic Memo technique asks students to write a 1 to 2 page analysis of a specific problem or issue for potential employer or client. The defining features matrix technique asks students to complete a defining features matrix relative to something that they have just learned. These alternative assessment techniques would be appropriately used to assess the student's ability to synthesize multiple sources of information or to think creatively about what they've learned. The one-sentence summary technique asks students to summarize something that they've studied. Summaries must be a single, grammatically correct sentence and include who does what to whom, when, where, how, and why something happens. The invented dialogues technique asks students to create a dialogue between individuals, for example, Socrates and Aristotle. The concept maps technique asks students to create drawings or diagrams showing the connections between course concepts. If we focus them around real-world tasks, both traditional and alternative assessments can be made purposefully authentic. And as Barry pointed out, there are benefits to learning and to motivation of making assessments authentic. These are some of the characteristics of authentic assessments. As I said previously, they are close approximations of real-world tasks. That is, to the extent possible, authentic assessments ask students to do the sort of thinking, decision-making, planning, and collaborating that professionals in their disciplines do. They tend to be complex and messy, and like the real world, they often require collaboration. A particularly important aspect of authentic assessment is that students are provided with opportunities to reflect on what they did and how they did it, and to learn from their reflections. That is, they learn to detect and correct their errors. These are some examples of authentic assessment techniques. And these are some additional examples of authentic assessment techniques. As I mentioned previously, authentic assessment includes opportunities for students to reflect on what they did and how they did it, and to learn from their reflections. Self and peer assessment offers students those opportunities to reflect and to learn. As Barry pointed out, self and peer assessment requires students to reflect on their own learning and anticipate what should be done to improve it. Thinking about their own thinking develops students' metacognitive abilities. These are some guidelines for self and peer assessment. When implementing self and peer assessment, it's important to explain why you're doing it. Students should understand that it's relevant to their learning and to their future professional development. Self and peer assessment should be introduced slowly and in a non-threatening way. Moreover, to ensure success, students should be working with clear criteria. Regardless of the mix of traditional and alternative assessments you use, there are guidelines to follow. First, assessments should match and measure learning outcomes. Second, they should be tasks that enable students to demonstrate their progress and capabilities. Third, assessments should ideally be authentic and related to real-life experiences of students. Fourth, assessments should represent the content and the skills the teacher expects the students to attain. Fifth, they should be assessments that lend themselves to an interdisciplinary approach. Sixth, assessments should be structured to provide measures of learning. Let's talk a bit about the practicalities of giving assessments in hybrid and online classes. Specifically, let's look briefly at the tools that Blackboard offers for giving assessments. In addition, let's look at the steps involved in making assessments as transparent as possible. For quizzes, tests, and exams, Blackboard offers the tests, pools, and surveys tools. For papers of all sorts, Blackboard offers the assignments tool. For participation, Blackboard offers the discussion and groups tools. To use the test tool, instructors can type each question manually or randomly pull from a pool of questions. Instructors can use a variety of different types of test questions, including multiple choice, true-false, short answer, matching, essay, and upload a file. Some types of test questions are graded automatically. Others require manual grading. In Blackboard, pools are groups of test questions. For example, instructors can create pools for each chapter or for each major topic. Pools are useful for creating quizzes or tests with randomly selected questions. These are some best practices for using Blackboard options when giving tests online. These suggestions are from the George Washington University Instructional Technology Lab. Faculty are encouraged to break up long tests, use a combination of item formats, use assignments for essay questions, randomize alternatives, randomize questions using pools, to refrain from using forced completion, to set the view to one question at a time, and to use a timer with auto submit turned on. These are some additional best practices for using Blackboard options when giving tests online. Instructors are encouraged to tell students to email if they get kicked out, use test availability exceptions to meet diverse needs, decide when to release feedback, to preview tests as a student, to consider running practice tests, and to prepare students with clear instructions and policies. Although not currently supported by Blackboard, there are Blackboard quiz generators available online that can be helpful if an instructor has a test that has already been created in Word. With some basic editing, questions can be copy-pasted into the Blackboard quiz generator to create a pool of questions that can be uploaded to Blackboard and included in a test. To use the assignment tool, the instructor creates the instructions for the assignment. Students submit their work as Word, PDF, or PowerPoint files. Faculty can provide feedback using grading rubrics and/or by writing comments. In addition, the assignment tool allows student work to be processed through SafeAssign to assess academic integrity. These pictures illustrate the tools available in Blackboard to draw on, highlight, and/or add typed comments on a submitted assignment. To use the discussion board tool, instructors post text, links, or files for students to view and discuss. Students can also post text, links, and files for the instructor and their classmates to view and discuss. Discussion posts can be graded or ungraded. Transparent teaching methods, including making assignments transparent. The goal in transparent teaching method is to help students understand how and why they're learning course content. Transparent teaching methods include four main strategies. First, learning goals and design rationales are provided before students begin assignments. Second, instructors gauge students' understanding of course material during class via peer work on questions that require students to apply course concepts. Third, instructors explicitly share information about how people learn with students when they struggle at difficult transition points. Fourth, instructors engage students in applying the grading criteria that will be used on their work. Transparent teaching methods can be applied in the creation of transparent assessments. To make assessments transparent, do the following. First, chart out the skills students will practice in each assignment. Second, begin each assignment by defining the learning benefits to the student, including the skills practiced, the content knowledge gained, the task to be completed, and the criteria for success. Third, provide criteria for success in advance. Fourth, offer examples of successful work and annotate them to indicate how the criteria apply. This is an example of what a transparent assessment would look like. It includes an assignment name and due date, a description of its purpose, a description of the task, and a description of the criteria for success. Let's talk now about supporting academic integrity. There are online proctoring tools available outside the university. However, there are pros and cons associated with using online proctoring tools. Pros include increasing academic integrity and testing fairness. Cons include increasing student anxiety, threatening privacy, and enhancing stereotype threat. A more positively focused strategy for increasing academic integrity centers around the use of optimal assessments, assessments that are authentic. Authentic assessments, because of their complexity, are less likely to result in violations of academic integrity. There is no single correct response that can be shared across students. Other, more positively focused strategies center around building a campus-wide culture that supports academic integrity. Robinson and Glanzer focused on optimizing teaching and assessment, saying that the key to supporting academic integrity is teaching faculty how to 1. Foster intrinsic motivation in their students, 2. Create environments that prize mastery of learning over performance learning, 3. Focus on low-stakes assessments, which offer students ample opportunity to practice their knowledge of classroom concepts, and 4. Instill a confident yet realistic self-efficacy within their students. Focusing on building a culture of academic integrity, Plascik and Brazeau focused on emphasizing learning and professionalism as strategies for increasing academic integrity. They suggested that faculty immerse students in practice settings with good role models. They also suggested emphasizing scientific integrity and professionalism in many different settings, including classes, labs, and research activities. They also encouraged faculty to help students take an active role in setting and developing procedures for ensuring academic integrity. Cavicco and Mujtaba also emphasized learning and professionalism as strategies for increasing academic integrity. In addition, they suggested that faculty get to know their students and monitor their progress across the semester. They also emphasized the importance of involving the whole student in the learning process. That is, they advised that students need to not only learn information, but they also need to come to care about the information they're learning and to value it. The fourth challenge I'll address is providing feedback. As Barry points out, feedback needs to be meaningful to students. It also needs to convey information that they understand. And most importantly, feedback needs to be acted upon by students. There are several different types of feedback, including motivational feedback, evaluative feedback, and learning feedback. Motivational feedback and evaluative feedback aren't particularly helpful for learning. Learning feedback is the type that is necessary for learning. It explains why certain work is good and provides suggestions for improvement. It provides guidance and engages students in their learning. Grades, of course, provide feedback. However, they mostly provide evaluative feedback. As such, they don't really facilitate learning. They don't tell the student what was good or not so good about their work and how they can make improvements. These are some principles that can help us provide feedback. First, we need to provide enough detail about strengths and weaknesses. Second, we need to give feedback in a timely manner. Third, we need to focus our feedback on things that students can control. Fourth, we need to match our feedback with learning objectives. Finally, we need to require students to act on feedback. As Stevens and Levi said, rubrics have become very popular. They not only provide explicit feedback to students, but they make scoring student work easier. Rubrics are scoring tools, and they lay out the specific expectations for an assignment. That is, they divide the assignment's component parts and provide a detailed description of what constitutes acceptable or unacceptable levels of performance for each part. Rubrics include a description of the task, a scale that captures the levels of achievement, the dimensions of the assignment, and a description of what each level of performance looks like. This is an example of a grading rubric for a written assignment. The levels are shown across the top row. The dimensions are shown down the left-hand column. The descriptions of each level of performance for each dimension complete the table. This is another example of a grading rubric. This one is for a discussion board posting. This is yet another example of a grading rubric. This one is for an oral presentation. The last challenge I'll address is grading. There are several ways to make grading more efficient. First, we can create assignments that have clear goals and criteria for assessment. With clear goals and criteria, grading is more efficient. Second, we can use different grading scales for different assignments, including letter grades, numerical grades, or check, check plus, check minus scales. If our grading criteria are simpler, our scale can be simpler. If our criteria are more complex, our grading scales can be more complex. Third, we don't need to comment on everything. Students don't always read comments, so it makes sense to limit them to notations and feedback that your students can use for further learning or improvement. Fourth, it helps to establish a grading schedule and stick to it. Finally, we don't have to grade everything. Not every piece of work needs our full attention or a grade assigned to it. Today's workshop describes some of the challenges inherent in assessing learning in hybrid and online classes, and identified evidence-based strategies for responding to them. We touched on the use of traditional assessments and on the importance of writing good multiple-choice questions when using them. We touched on the use of alternative assessments and looked at a sampling of alternative assessments that fit the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy. We discussed the benefits of using authentic assessment. We peeked into Blackboard and viewed the assessment tools Blackboard provides. We discussed strategies for increasing academic integrity, including creating a culture of academic integrity. And finally, we talked about providing feedback, using rubrics, and grading. If you'd like to follow up by looking at any of them yourself, these are the references for the sources cited in this presentation.